Our next presentation is by Solveig Cunningham, and she will be presenting to us on understanding food choices in the context of globalizing food options, evidence from a novel picture method in India.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for sticking around into the afternoon. It's a pleasure to talk with you today about some work that is part of the Drivers of Food Choice Competitive Grants Program. This is this is a project that's in collaboration with colleagues at BLD University here in India, as well as Georgia State University and University of Southern California in the US. So the context for this project is the changing burden of disease that we've talked quite a bit about this year as in past years at the ANH conference, with underweight continuing to be a leading cause of morbidity and mortality worldwide, and at the same time increases in chronic diseases increasing worldwide, including in India. A recent study has shown that, that there's perhaps a crossover in unhealthy weight, even in urban areas, with underweight being present among children and overweight affecting nearly half of the adult population in urban areas. And there are many reasons why we can, for the increases in chronic diseases. Many of them probably have to do with population aging. The one that we tend to be particularly interested in our group here is the idea of the nutrition transition. And here the proposition is that with globalization and economic development, people, even in remote places, are exposed to new items. We often focus on the negative consequences in that these new exposures often introduce calorie-rich, nutrient-poor items. At the same time, there are likely also positive associations with this globalization, including increasing stability of food markets as well as diversity of options. So to try to understand the nutrition transition and how and how people's food choices are perhaps changing or evolving in the context of the nutrition transition, we conducted a study in Karnataka state in southern India. This is about 8 hours south of here. The center of the study is Bijapur city. It's the main urban center in the district, the capital, about 350,000 population. This is quite a remote area, so not only is it about 8 hours from here, it's about 8 hours from most other major locations. And it's an area that's undergoing rapid changes in terms of their food environments as well as social and economic change. So the research questions with which we try to approach this question of the changing drivers of food choice in the context of the nutrition transition. Firstly, we want to know, how do people make decisions about their food consumption when they're faced with new food options that they didn't have before that may be competing with their traditional foods? And joined with that, under what conditions are global versus traditional items selected? So to begin this process, we used data from an ongoing project in which we had mapped out everything that you could buy to eat and drink in this area over several years, from which we had created a food database of about 1,000 foods. From this database, we basically classified all of the items into 6 categories: cereals and pulses, fruits and vegetables, animal products, snacks and sweets, oils, sweeteners and condiments, and drinks. And then each of these food groups was then classified based on our previous work in terms of its relationship in the local food environment. So some items were classified as traditional or local. These are foods that have been eaten in this area for generations. Some foods were national but local. So Indian foods that are largely available but would not have been eaten here, for example, in our grandmother's time. And thirdly, modern or global foods that are coming from outside of India, whether it be the US, Europe, or China. And so we have, within each of the food groups, we have foods that are traditional, national, or modern. So that as part of our research, respondents were shown food group triads. So, for example, if we were to talk about fruit, a respondent would see 3 picture cards: one with a local fruit, one with a national fruit, one with a global fruit, and they would be asked questions among those. So we're thinking of food as interchangeable within food groups. If I want a banana, maybe I won't take a yogurt, but I might consider an apple, or I might consider a dragon fruit. To reduce respondent burden, as we do have a lot of possible items that people may choose from, we randomly assign each respondent to see randomly selected cards as part of these triads. So you might see other cards. As a respondent, with respect to the savory snacks groups, you may see these cards, or other combinations thereof. So then we constructed a choice game that involved short questionnaires relating to the picture cards like the ones that I just showed you. These are meant to assess familiarity. So have people even seen these items before? Where have they seen them? Have they eaten them? How frequently? And then we asked people to some choice scenarios within each food group triad. Which would you select under various conditions? So the data that I'll show you today is from a pilot study that involved a hospital-based sample. So the sample consisted of 100 non-patient adults who were visiting or waiting for a friend or a relative at the hospital. So we did not sample people who were there for treatment or who were sick. The majority of the respondents were lower income rural people who had come from this district or from other districts in the neighborhood. So let's move on to the results, and I'll show you a few slides that look like this. Basically, we have down the columns the fruit groups that I described earlier. So fruits and vegetables, cereals and pulses, etc. Along the rows, we have local, national, and global items. Within that, we have the distribution, the percentages of people responding accordingly. So what I'm showing you here is responses to the question about, have you seen this item? So thinking about back to those picture cards. And specifically, they were asked with respect to the local, national, and global foods, whether they had seen these advertised, whether they had eaten it with a friend, whether they had seen it at the market, thank you, whether they had it at home. Basically what we see here is that people were very much familiar with local and traditional foods. They had them at their houses. They had seen them at the markets. National foods were less common to have at home, but many of them were recognized from the markets. The global foods had not been seen had been seen at the market, but most people did not have them at their home. To the extent that any foods were seen advertised, it was global foods. The recognition from advertisement was quite low. Then we asked people, had they eaten these foods? And here we see that universally people, as you'd expect, had eaten local and traditional foods. The majority had also eaten national and mixed foods. And some, about half, had tried global or modern foods. When we asked about frequency of consumption, we saw that while many people had tried at some point in their lives national and perhaps global foods, very few of them had them frequently. Then we asked them some scenarios, as I described earlier. If you had an additional 250 rupees, what would you eat? If you wanted something tasty, something healthy, if you were hungry, if there was little time for preparation, which of these items would you choose? Generally, to give you an idea of what's going on here, is that people are selecting across all of these conditions. They're really sticking to their local and their traditional foods. Those are the items that are preferred across the conditions. If we look at the extent to which people are shifting, so for example, if you had more money, would you shift from a local food towards a non-local food? We're seeing very little evidence of people shifting across any of the conditions that we presented them. To the extent that people were perhaps interested in shifting, it tended to be with respect to cereals and pulses. So to summarize, I think the best place to leave off with this preliminary work is to talk about what the research priorities might be as we think about policies and programs. So we know that food environments are changing, as I and others have talked about even in this session. So for us to be able to decide whether we need to intervene, and if we do need to intervene, what kind of interventions are appropriate, we must understand how do people interact with the changing food environments. thinking about the foods that they have at their disposal that are newly arrived, what is adopted, thinking about the foods that have been eaten for generations, what is abandoned and what is retained, and why. Are we talking about characteristics of these foods that may be important, characteristics of the changing markets, characteristics of the individuals, for example, their own budgets and preferences? What's the time frame of change? And how do these decisions change over time with increasing exposure and with changing conditions, for example, financial well-being? Thanks very much. Thanks to our funders and thanks to our participants.